White text over video of past events. Logo, Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium. Professional Development Series presents Cultural Communities Advancing Disability Rights. Split screen. At right, the presenting speaker. At left, an ASL interpreter signs.
And it looks like we will go ahead and get things going. So hello and welcome for everyone here for the Cultural Communities Advancing Disability Rights presented by the Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium, otherwise known as the CCAC. My name is Nick Joseph and I'm a steering committee member with the CCAC. I'm also serve as an education coordinator at the Museum of Science and Industry. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a white male in my mid-30s, a visual description of myself. Again, a white male in my mid-30s, red hair, red beard. I have some dark quarter-rimmed eyeglasses on. I'm wearing a navy blue shirt with a neutral gray background behind me. All right, and for those of you who are not familiar with the CCAC, our mission is to empower Chicago's cultural spaces to become more accessible to visitors with disabilities. There are four primary pillars that are central to all the work that we do, and those pillars include free professional development workshops, an accessible equipment loan program, accessible event calendar, and our recently launched statewide consortium, the Illinois Cultural Accessibility Consortium, otherwise known as ICANN. Accessibility is a priority for us, and our program today includes real-time captioning provided by efficiency reporting, as well as ASL interpretation provided by AI media. If you'd like to view the captions in a separate browser, you can do so using the stream text link that is included in the chat below. So if you go to that chat function, we'll have that stream text link for you if you'd like to view captioning in a different browser. We also have the Q&A feature enabled, and we just encourage you to utilize that feature throughout the program today to submit your questions, any questions that you may have for our panel discussion that'll be coming up toward the end of the program. So if you have any issues with accessibility, please feel free, don't hesitate to reach out to us using the chat function. So our support team will be monitoring that. So any accessibility questions you may have or issues, use that chat. If you have any questions about what you're hearing during the program that you would like us to answer during our panel discussion, use the Q&A for that. All right, so for today's event, we have some fabulous guests. We're really excited to be bringing this to you all today, and we're excited to have you here. We'll be kicking things off with a brief presentation on the history of disability rights that will be followed by a dynamic panel discussion and a live Q&A portion. So remember, if you have those questions, pop them in the Q&A for us. And to kick things off, I'm very pleased to welcome one of our guests today that will be providing us with some historical context as a foundation for our program today. So please welcome Ashley Eisenmenger. Ashley, feel free to come on screen. And Ashley is a training specialist at Access Living. Ashley speaks regularly to groups about topics such as perspective, adversity, performance, and disability. Ashley, if you'd like to go ahead and share your pronouns and a brief image description of yourself, I am going to go off screen and the Zoom room is yours.
At left, presentation slides. At top right, speaker. Below, an ASL interpreter signs. First slide, text. A brief overview of disability rights presented by Access Living, accessliving.org.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman. I have long brown hair and I'm wearing a peach colored shirt. I'm coming to you from my kitchen, so you can see some cabinetry behind me. Today, I'm going to give a really brief skim, if you will, of some disability history that led into the disability rights movement as a whole, so that we have some context going into today's panel. Next slide, please.
Title, Who We Are.
So just to give a little bit of information about Access Living, the organization I'm coming from and speaking on behalf of today, we are a service and advocacy center for people with disabilities, run and led by people with disabilities. Our main areas of work are advocacy, independent living, skills training, legal services, and then consulting and training. Next slide, please.
Title: What is disability?
So in an effort to level set the room and level set the conversation, I thought it was really important to define disability just so that we could all be on the same page. So a disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. These can include things such as seeing, hearing, ambulating, communicating, etc. Disability can occur on a spectrum. It impacts folks differently, even if they have the same diagnoses. Disabilities can be visible, non-apparent, or both. They can ebb and flow. They don't often present consistently. And a disability can be acquired at any point in someone's life, regardless of their circumstances. It is more likely than not that you know someone who identifies as having a disability, or you yourself have a disability. And if neither of those things ring true for you at present, they will eventually, given the prevalence of disability. Next slide, please.
Title: Evolving Perspectives of Disability.
So looking at understanding disability, we kind of need to understand how we view it, how we hold beliefs about it, and what that means for creating spaces for inclusion and accessibility. So there are two main schools of thought when it comes to disability. There's the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. The medical model of disability basically says that disability is something that needs fixed, that professionals know best. So people like doctors, teachers, folks in power, etc., know what's best for individuals. And then it's kind of centered on this idea of helplessness, or the fact that folks experiencing disability have special needs. There's the social model of disability, more prevalent in current times today amongst members of the disability community, but that's not necessarily the case once you step out of that community. And what this model says is that disability is a natural part of life. The majority of us will experience it in one way or another. Folks with disabilities are their own best advocates because of their lived experiences. And then that disability rights are civil rights, and that at our core, we are humans entitled to the same rights as other humans, regardless of how we interact with the world around us. Next slide, please.
Title: Independent Living. Black and white photographs of protesters show Ed Roberts before a sign reading "Civil Rights for Disabled," a black man with a service dog, and a group of people using wheelchairs titled "The Rolling Quads."
So to give you a bit of history, I wanted to talk about the independent living movement as it pertains to disability rights. So the independent living movement started in the 70s, and it's really what drove that social construct or that social model of disability. So in 1972, the first Center for Independent Living was co-founded. Centers for Independent Living provide an organizing network that could be used to build support for future civil rights legislation, such as the ADA. Centers for Independent Living also played a key role in building and organizing support for folks experiencing disability. So what really came out of this movement was this idea of peer support and this idea that folks with disabilities needed to be at the table when decisions were made. The independent living movement spawned from the inaccessibility of higher education, and folks organized and advocated for reasonable accommodations and better access in college settings. And that movement has springboarded from Berkeley, California in 1972, where the first Center for Independent Living was founded, to there now being over 400 centers for independent living across the country, all doing advocacy to create better accessibility and inclusion in spaces. What this essentially says is that folks deserve to be in every space that humans are in. And so having people with disabilities at the center of conversations or decision-making is kind of essential for driving opportunities for inclusion and accessibility. The independent living movement is arguably still going on today. So again, very, very brief skim of that. But it really was the foundation that led us to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Next slide, please.
Title: What is the ADA?
So what is the Americans with Disabilities Act? It was approved in 1990. The ADA is a piece of federal civil rights legislation that prohibits discrimination based on disability. The ADA defines a disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. Major life activities include most things: working, walking, listening, seeing, self-care type behaviors and modalities. The ADA also protects folks who are regarded by others as having a disability. So a lot of facial scarring or other like outwardly apparent, basically anyone who has an outward appearance of disability is protected. Next slide, please.
Title: What does the ADA cover?
So very, 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 very high level explanation of some of the things that the ADA covers. So Title I covers employment. It says that people can't face workplace discrimination due to their disability. Title II has to do with public services, specifically the state and local government. It's made to grant access to all of those processes. You cannot be discriminated against due to a disability when we look at eligibility for public programs, activities, and services. And then Title III is public accommodations and services operated by private entities, businesses, and spaces open to the public cannot discriminate due to disability. Next slide, please.
Title: The promise of the ADA has not been realized.
So the ADA has not been fully realized. Even as I read the information on that last slide, talking about some of the things that the ADA covers as general and high level as that was, we know that there's a lot of work to do. Disabled people are disproportionately unemployed. In Chicago, the poverty rate is twice as high for disabled folks compared to non-disabled folks. We know COVID-19 has exacerbated these disparities even further. And folks are continuing to do advocacy around disability access in like digital spaces and physical spaces, and the world has continued to advance, and the ADA has kind of been at a standstill. So 30 plus years later, still working to implement some of its initial promises is no small task, and there are a lot of people advocating to continue to do all of that, just as the folks on this panel are as well. Next slide, please.
Title: Self-Advocacy.
And then just to wrap up this presentation, I wanted to circle back on this idea of self-advocacy because I think it's so important to maintain as we talk about what accessibility could look like in cultural spaces. I tried to find examples of situations that were more applicable to this group, and I couldn't find a ton. And what that tells me is that these spaces have felt off limits to disabled folks for a really long time, and that the work of this group and all of you is so important to create opportunities for disabled people to occupy these spaces. So the self-advocacy movement took place around the same time as the independent living movement. It focused on folks with intellectual disabilities, but even today, this movement continues and it's been embraced by the disability community at large. Essentially, the goal here is to reduce isolation and gain tools to have greater control in making life decisions, whether that be deciding to go see a show or having choice over restaurants that you might eat dinner at. Accessibility shouldn't be a determinant in that choice. In an ideal world, everything would be an option because everything is accessible and inclusive. So like I said, this was just a really, really short presentation to kind of give everyone an overview. I'm going to toss it back over to Nick to introduce the panel, but thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
At left ASL, at right Nick.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for that insightful overview, talking about that historical context of disability rights, and that'll hopefully get us going to start with our panel discussion, which Ashley was just mentioning. So I am thrilled to invite our featured guest. We have 3 panelists along with our moderator that'll be coming on screen in a moment. So for first off, we would like to please welcome Charlie Petrof. Charlie, if you want to go ahead and get on this, put your screen on. Charlie is a senior attorney at Access Living, focusing on enforcement of the Americans with Disability Act. Charlie, if you please could go ahead and share your pronouns and a brief image description of yourself.
Charlie in bottom row.
Hi, my name's Charlie Petrof, and I use he, him. I am a early 50s white male with graying hair. I'm wearing a white button-down shirt and a blue sport coat, kind of the uniform of my profession. And in the background are file cabinets, because in my early 50s, I still litigate using a lot of paper.
Thanks so much for that, Charlie. And next up, we have Richard Costas. Richard is a Chicago-based actor, director, and accessibility consultant. Richard, if you could please go ahead and share your pronouns and a brief image description of yourself.
Richard in bottom row.
Hi, my name is Richard Costas. My pronouns are he, his, him. I am a late 30-something South Asian man with dark black hair down to the shoulders, and I am currently wearing a black button-up shirt. Behind me is my home office, which includes a bookshelf, chair, and my cat's special place. Heidi Ho.
Thanks so much for that, Richard. And our final panelist, we have Whitney Hall. Whitney is an accessibility specialist at LCM Architects and founder/director of Spork. So Whitney, if you could go ahead and give us share your pronouns and a brief image description of yourself as well.
Whitney in bottom row.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Whitney Hill. I am an African-American female, and my image description, sorry, my pronouns are she, her, hers. So my image description is short brown hair, solid white background behind me. You can see a little bit of a blue and white striped shirt and a black cardigan over that.
Thank you so much for that, Whitney. And finally, our moderator for today's panel discussion, Zhen Heinemann. Zhen is a CCAC steering committee member, just like myself, and is also the director of visitor experience at the City of Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. So Zhen, if you could please share your pronouns and a brief image description of yourself.
Zhen in top row.
Hi, I'm Zhen Heinemann. I use they, she pronouns. I am a white person with an ombre gray, blue to black hair that's up in 2 buns, one on either side of my head. I'm wearing big green headphones and tortoiseshell glasses with a dark lip. And I have on a checkerboard and striped black and brown dress. And I'm sitting in my office at the Cultural Center, which is full of colorful drawings and tapestries and signs and sign stands and many, many chaotic things.
Thank you so much for that description, Jen. And thank you all for being here. I'm now going to hand it over to Jen to start our panel discussion. And then at 5:05, we'll be moving into our live Q&A. So again, use that Q&A if you have any questions throughout the discussion. Drop those in there so that we can use them during our live Q&A. So Jen, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you, Nick, and thank everyone who is listening here on the webinar for being here as well. We're super glad to have you today. We have a bunch of great questions that we prepared that we're going to discuss with the panel, and then we'll get to your questions that you are dropping in the Q&A. As a note, because we need to stay on time, at some points I may need to put Charlie, Richard, or Whitney and say, let's move on. And if you guys want to hear more about what they were saying, feel free to check them out on the socials, LinkedIn, and for Richard and Whitney. And for Charles, you have to go to Access Living to get him. But feel free to contact them then to get more information from them directly, just so that we could make sure that we get to your questions. A reminder to all our panelists, when you start speaking, please reiterate your name. This is Zhen. And then we will get going. All right, for our first intro question. What disability rights issues are at the forefront for each of you?
Hi.
Charlie, Whitney.
Oh, sorry. Hi, this is Whitney. I would want to say that it's our current situation right now. We were able to transition into, with COVID, into this remote access and this better understanding of how to utilize online and really use that space in a different way. And I think that there's a lot of room to continue that improvement and to continue to include people with disabilities within the improvement of that technology. And how programs use that technology.
Charlie?
This is Charlie. And actually, I'm going to say, like, it's the past and the future are the hot issues. When Ashley talked about passing the ADA, that was back in 1990. And one of the major demonstrations that finally got Congress to pass the bill was the Capitol crawl, where people wheeled up or otherwise got to the steps of the Capitol and attempted to gain access to the building. And in a city like ours, which was mostly built before 1990, access to the front door and through the front door remains one of the things people complain to me about. At the same time, when the ADA was passed, there's really very little in it about mental health or behavioral health, or a lot of other disabilities that aren't disabilities that affect communication or the ability to ambulate. And I think we're really trying to move in those directions in a lot of our work, trying to actually embrace ways to make the world accessible to those populations as well.
This is Richard. I would say the disability rights issues that are at the forefront for me, a lot of it is the same as what Charlie said and what Ashley mentioned earlier, that the promise of the ADA has not yet been fully realized. and that we still have workplace discrimination. We still discriminated in government programs. We still have discrimination when we go into businesses. And the other thing that something that's been really taking a lot of my focus recently is making sure to view disability through a more intersectional lens, through ethnicity, through gender, through sexuality, and through economic brackets, as all four of those things greatly impact how disability is viewed and throughout the world.
Thank you, panelists. Charlie, that made me think a lot about how that Capitol crawl was almost an action of performance art, right? And being here together as cultural practitioners and organizations or advocates, it's interesting to think about the way sometimes performance and these cultural spaces or cultural actions can further kind of disability visibility, right? Or disability rights visibility. And Richard, thank you for that. That statement from you made me also think about training and kind of at what point are, like if a business is giving you a harder time because you're coming in with a disability, where, you know, have they ever been trained on how to not, you know, check their implicit bias or things like that. So the next one is, what are some basics to think about when designing accessible spaces?
Yes, I think this is Whitney. I think that if it's either design the physical space or if you're trying to design programming and policy, I feel like you have to include your core demographic within that planning process. If you are creating a special space for people with disabilities, how are you actually utilizing and using those voices from the community? Are you asking for their input of what is currently not working for them? All of that is going to inform you with your next step. And then beyond that, there's specialists. I'm an accessibility specialist. There's WCAG specialist, web accessibility specialist. There are a series of ADA networks. We have a wonderful one based out of UIC, and you can consult with these people to make sure that you're at least moving in the right direction. What we typically see is people who might have maybe a loose understanding of what accessibility even means, or what inclusive design, what that even is supposed to look like. And they interpret that for themselves, or they try to interpret the law for themselves. It's a very dense law. There's a lot of nuances. There's a lot that you can potentially miss and get wrong from the beginning. And that goes into a whole other conversation of just the general fear people have. When I feel like when people view the ADA, they see a great deal of guidelines that they have to try to sort out by themselves, and that is going to be a huge financial burden to them. And there's a lot of myth that is around that. The ADA does have wording in there to make sure that there is no undue burden onto you as you're trying to structure out and rebuild your physical spaces for accessibility. So and once again, I feel like talk to the specialist, talk to your core demographic, try to make sure that you're starting the process correctly and that you're including those voices at the beginning throughout the entire process. I feel like that is the best surefire way to make sure that it's going to be successful, and that you have actually a better understanding and relationship than with your clientele, because you have actively included their input.
This is Zhen. Thank you, Whitney. I did want to add that WCAG, in case folks on the call don't know, is the internet, the website kind of, and web world accessibility rules, right? Yeah. So that for those of you that were listening and picked that up, and Whitney, I loved hearing you say basically design for access, right? And and find a consultant, talk to your population, so you don't have to retrofit. Retrofitting is often very wonky. All right, I'm going to move on to the next one. How can we apply a disability rights perspective when we think about all experiences? Employees, volunteers, artists, patrons, stakeholders, etc.
Richard grins.
Richard, I see you wanna jump in first. This is Zhen.
This is Richard. I've been thinking about this question a lot. I work primarily in the theater, in the arts out here in Chicago. And I've had the experience of working in all of those sections as an employee, volunteer, artist, patrons, stakeholders. There definitely is a level of disparity. And when we think of art accessibility, when we enter a theater space, I think most accessibility these days I see geared more towards patrons, the people that actually are paying for the tickets. And what's often left behind are accessibility for volunteers, accessibility for the artists themselves. One of the things I try to do in when I consult with various theaters throughout the city is I try to stress that if you really want to make an effort to consider disability rights, especially in theater, you need to start casting more inclusive productions. And I think this goes for the wide range of arts. You need to create more inclusive art galleries, more inclusive movies or whatever it is. You need to have disabled artists, not just disabled viewers, not just disabled employees, volunteers. You need to make sure that your organizations are stocked with disabled leaders. You need to make sure that disability starts from the top down. And I really do think that disabled leaders is probably the #1 biggest thing that you can do if you really want to focus on having a disability rights perspective when you start thinking about all experiences. There's a phrase that is used often in the disability community, and that is, nothing about us without us. And I think that when you have disabled leaders in your organizations, you're able to create a far more inclusive programming than you could without them. Because a lot of what we talked about right now in terms of the ADA, you have to remember that the ADA is the bare minimum. It is the bare minimum of what you're legally obligated to provide. You can do so much more, and the people that are best situated to offer you the chance to do that much more are disabled leaders within your organization.
This is Whitney. To piggyback off of what Richard said, I think it's also incredibly important to really understand that disability hits communities in a different way. And so when we're looking at access, if you're looking and trying to figure out how come we don't have a certain demographic showing up and you're feeling like you're doing the right thing, I feel like you need to dig a little bit deeper. Is the transportation access there for that community to even come to you? Are you representing that community? I have to say, from a Black woman with, disabilities that are widely, non-apparent, how I navigate the world and access my own, things outside of my apartment looks very different than some of my other counterparts who might be white or have more apparent disabilities, who might live in a different part of the city. So I just think it's really important to take all of that in and really try to understand and empathize what those barriers actually look like.
This is Charlie, and you're not going to get any argument, I guess, from any of us on the panel on this question. We have a similar view. If I could share anything, is that actually from a litigation perspective, if I looked at this question and had to do an essay response, I would feel like I'd never be able to give a proper essay response to it. But from a litigation perspective, I also would say it's not about looking at the specific regulations or the 2010 standards or any of the detailed rules. I think the basic motivation, like Richard started by telling us, is that this is about integrating people in our society, that we have kept people with disabilities segregated out of mainstream society, segregated out of jobs, segregated out of performance spaces, segregated out of cultural spaces. Our cultural institutions are almost, our major ones are almost all glorified with giant stairways right at the front, just broadcasting the lack of who can go in there. Get up these stairs or you're not wanted, sort of a view. And so if you have a group of 10 people and one of them doesn't have a disability, there's something about your group that isn't integrated. And you need to figure out what those blocks are. If you can figure those out, you'll probably find yourself complying with a heck of a lot of the law anyway.
Thank you, panel. That was fabulous. I know we could spend probably a full day on that one, I'm sure. Next is, what is one accessibility essential that is commonly overlooked? Your hottest take.
This is Richard. I'll go first again. This is probably a more personal accessibility essential that's commonly overlooked. And that is that when you have access nights, whether it's a closed caption night or an ASL interpreter night, you are not providing equitable access. You are saying that you can only attend on this one specific day. I am a very, very busy individual. I would love to go see everyone's shows, but when captions overlap with my job, my other activities I do, it means that I'm locked out of seeing that show just because I simply do not have the time to go on the specific day that you offer the access that I need. So my big accessibility essential would be make sure that the access you offer is available every day and not just one specific day.
This is Whitney. The one accessibility feature that I always love seeing online when I go to a website is a simple know before you go page. I think that there is a lot to be said about simply putting all your accessibility information, all of the basic information someone might need from getting point A to point B to the entrance of your door in one concise place on your website. It's beautiful, and it really does help not only people with disabilities, but it helps people who might be new to the city, who might, you never know how someone might use that information. So, don't hide that information. If there is a way that you can put it out there publicly and in a, like Richard was saying, in a very consistent way as well, then I think that that's great. And it's also very low cost.
This is Charlie. I happen to be raising a teenager and a preteen right now. And maybe that is influencing what I'm going to offer here, but I would say bathrooms. People don't think about basic need. If you're going to be out somewhere for more than 10 to 15 minutes, a lot of people can't come and join your activity if they don't have an ability to take care of these basic bodily functions. And admittedly, like there's a cost here. Our society liked to save money on bathrooms and have one that was small. It also needs to be big enough to get, basic care taken care of. But I think that's, all these answers are great, but that's another one I'd toss out there is the seedy underbelly of human existence. We all need access to that sort of facility.
This is Zhen. Thank you, panel. If you don't mind, Charlie, I'd love to add on your bathroom comment that something that I've seen in my time is that gender neutral bathrooms or family bathrooms, all access bathrooms are really key. And it's not just a gender, identity issue. It's also that sometimes people have caregivers with them who are not of the same gender. And then, you know, that really complicates being able to take care of a basic human function that is, makes them be able to stay and have a good time and enjoy themselves at the place. So thank you. All right. This is going to be our call to action questions. So if everybody, I'm sure, has been taking notes already, because these have been some great feedback from the panel, but what are some positive examples you've seen of cultural institutions getting it right? So any type of cultural institution, something that you've loved to see, something that really stuck with you that was a positive.
This is Whitney. The best example that comes to mind, when I was working in New England, there was this group called the MCC. They were local cultural institutions, businesses that were trying to better understand accessibility. And they created a cohort where they annually would actively work to bring in the disabled community to have a better input on their programming. It was phenomenal. It was similar and structure to this, but there is a physical aspect of really getting the people with disabilities physically into the spaces and giving the input in a very structured way that could be shared across all the institutions. And so it was amazing to be a part of that. Every single year, they constantly had other local businesses that wanted to get that seal of accessibility approval. So there was a sense of pride that came with it. And it really then became kind of this like coveted thing where you see that can be done on a small scale, a small theater as well as a huge theater with a standalone, a performance studio. They can all be a part of a cohort and experience the same sort of accessibility, input from each other. So that, I have to say that has to be probably the best example I have seen.
Sorry, this is Richard speaking. I'm going to talk about two theaters here in Chicago. They're both storefront theaters that I felt got it right for very different reasons. The first was a production by the now defunct theater called Oracle. And what I really, really appreciate about Oracle's production, specifically of the Harry VIII, was they made sure that access was available every day. That access was available there. And further, they helped launch what a lot of other theaters now have embraced, called the free theater movement. And the reason why I think this free theater movement is so fantastic is the statistic that I always use, because it is personal to me as a deaf individual, is that in the 2010 census, I believe it said that 70% of deaf or hard of hearing people are under or unemployed. If we want disabled individuals to go see art, we need to make sure that it is accessible to them, not just because of disability, but also economically. I think Charlie mentioned earlier that there's a lot of an economic hardship that people with disabilities often have to work to overcome. And for me, it was just going to theater doesn't just mean I have to come up with the cost of a ticket, I have to pay for parking, I have to pay for gas, pay for babysitters, I have all of this other economic things I have to consider. When you offer things like free tickets, you ensure that people from traditionally marginalized communities, which are disabled communities, communities of color, have the opportunity and access to see your productions, to see your cultural institutions at the same level that people who don't have those barriers do. The second thing the second company I thought was really, really great here in Chicago was a specific production of Red Twist. They did a production of Our Town, which I was lucky enough to be involved in. And one of the things that they did that I really, really appreciate was a cast, multiple people have disabilities within the cast, but their disability was never a point of the show. It was never the focal point of the show. Too often when I see disabled art presented by cultural institutions that are generally run by non-disabled people, disability becomes the focal point. And I would love to see disabled experiences not just limited to their disability. There's so much art and so much culture and so many experience that I have because my intersection is a brown, deaf, straight man that I could put into the art world, into the cultural community of Chicago that is not simply focused on one aspect of who I am. I think art and culture is so immense and so hard to define. It's not a monolith, and we need to be able to embrace the work of disabled individuals beyond what is simply one specific lens of their identity.
Yeah, this is Charlie, and I guess I'm gonna shout out to a theater too. Although since the pandemic, the closest thing I've come to doing much cultural is watching Netflix. And this Saturday, I hope to take my kids to the Field Museum and finally break out a little bit in terms of that world. So I definitely recognize that I'm behind the times. But I've appreciated the Access Project at Victory Gardens Theater in the past. And they've done some good work, and they have some people with disabilities in roles that can make decisions. And I think those are putting people, as Richard said, putting people with disabilities in higher level roles can really impact what your organization does. And if we have a little time, and just spin a little bit out of culture so I don't bash anyone who might be turning in here, but I've worked with really well-meaning large organizations who have sat at the tables with us and bemoaned the fact that they don't have any people on staff who identify as having a disability. And you know, I think this is one of the fundamental riddles we have to get through. You know, the lack of income and the lack of employment opportunities and for most people with disabilities is really profound and really limiting. And yet good-natured organizations somehow can't imagine themselves hiring people with disabilities, whatever that impediment is. Yes, sometimes it's transportation because it takes longer to move on certain forms of transportation. You know, sometimes it's work hours, but like, we are a creative people, and regardless of what we're doing, regardless if it's cultural or technical, I think there are, you know, it's really our creativity that is at fault for this chasm, for the economic chasm that is separating these groups. And so to the extent that cultural institutions do employment, it seems like that's a, you know, a place for us to do more work too.
I would like to add on to something Charlie said, if that's all right. This is Richard. Sorry, this is Richard. Charlie spoke he made a very, very good point about larger cultural institutions bemoaning the fact they don't have anybody who identifies as disabled on staff. The truth is, almost certainly do. They just might not necessarily feel safe in order to express that. There is a lot of stigma against especially more invisible disabilities, whether it is chronic pain, whether it is mental illness, and I think a lot of companies and organizations need to acknowledge the fact that disability is not something that is necessarily physically apparent in many times. And I think one of the things you could really, really do to make this place a safe space for people with disabilities to acknowledge they have disabilities is look at how you treat people when they say, I need an extra sick day, I need a mental health day. Do they feel comfortable asking you for that? Are they punished if they take too many sick days? Are they punished if they just need a day off to stop burnout from all of these other things that they're doing? You almost certainly have people with disabilities on your staff. You just might not be willing to admit it.
And this is Whitney. This is also just to bounce off of something Charlie said, which is, when we go to the community and we are asking people to talk about what issues they are seeing in their built environment, the issues that they're having with even getting through the door into your institution, I think that our society has an interesting way of valuing that information while also at the same time devaluing it. We take the information and we might hold really interesting panels where we're getting that information from the community, but we don't show any sort of compensation or this kind of understanding that what they're saying, their lived experience, their input does have some value to it. And to be honest, in the long run, if the organization is able to take the input and apply it to their programs, and that program is successful, they're going to be making more money. So I feel like there just has to be, if you're going to sincerely look at the input that's coming from the disabled community, if it's on a volunteer basis, if it's on a staff basis, really look at how you are compensating that input. It really makes a big difference.
This is Zhen. Thank you, panel. That was great. And I want to add that there's also I think there's also implicit bias from other employees that make it often unsafe for people don't feel unsafe, because if they take sick days and other employees start to look at them like, oh, you're getting some kind of special compensation, this like shame and bias that's built in. And I think, once again, training is really important to have in the workplace, in any cultural institution, but any workplace, I think, to help kind of open space for people to be their authentic selves at work and like bring the whole package and feel comfortable and do their best work.
And I'm sorry not to throw in one more thing, but that also just, I just want to throw in that there are a lot of people going through the workforce who are going through the process of getting a diagnosis. So they might not know at the time that they might need a reasonable accommodation. And so once again, that goes into how are you handling, when they're coming to you, are you grilling them on why they need it? Because that quickly can scare a person away from even feeling like they can even talk openly about what they might need in the future when they might actually have a diagnosis. So
this is Zhen. That also makes me think about the amount of friction and hurdles that it takes to sometimes even do that process, and how when people are living with a disability, especially at different points in their disability, that work might be too much work. It might be a process that's created in a way that is not supportive of people with disabilities. So I think you have to look, people who are employing HRs, things like that, have to look at their processes as well to really see, where is this coming from? Is this like your just basic capitalist structure, that kind of expects that everyone is not going to do their best work unless forced to, or, what is it? I see Charlie is laughing at that one. Thank you, everybody, for that discussion. If we can, do we feel good about moving on to the next one? Thank you. So the next question is, what would you challenge cultural institutions to do to advance inclusion initiatives at both the micro and macro level? So what is something small and hopefully something big that you want to challenge cultural institutions, cultural practitioners to do to advance disability rights?
Do you want to go, Whitney? I haven't
No,
gone
you can
first
go.
yet.
I feel like I've talked enough.
I don't know if that's, which way is the worst, going first or not. But anyway, this is Charlie. I think every cultural institution needs to designate someone for coordinating reasonable accommodations, and that in my practical experience, if there really is someone, a live human being who can actually be reached, a whole lot of people can be brought into your cultural institution by just, speaking to them, finding out what they specifically need and figuring out how your particular institution can provide it. You don't have to always rebuild the entire structure to offer a lot of accessibility. But as I think I've heard us all at some point say, like, if you want the big ticket item, I guess we're going to have to go with employment. We got to start bringing in a diverse workforce in terms of diversity of disability. Those are my two hot takes.
This is Whitney. I would say the micro is doing what the ADA says. I mean, like we've all mentioned before, that is the baseline. And the macro is excelling above and beyond what the ADA says. You don't have to wait until you're non-compliant to realize that you need to reach out to the community and figure out what you're doing wrong. Like, you don't have to wait until the building's on fire to put out the fire. And so, and that's my hot take. I feel like there's so much you can do with that. You can get so creative with that, with going above and beyond the ADA, with keeping accessibility and universal design in mind. And it is possible to have fun with that process and have fun with the community and learn more about your clients in a way that you might not have before. So take out the fear and like insert some fun with it.
This is Richard. I first want to answer Charlie's question as if it's better to go first or last. It's better to go first because Charlie took my answers. So I agree with Charlie, and like a small micro level, it really is super, super helpful to have one person there to coordinate accessible information. Like if I want to go see a show at the Goodman, I know who to contact there. If I want to go see a show at Steppenwolf, I know who I need to contact there to make sure that my needs are met. I would also double down at that and say that when you are designing your events within your cultural institution or organization, make sure you start talking about access on day one. Because far too often access is almost afterthought. You bring in the access coordinator very late into the process, and they have to figure out how to work in the captions, how to work in what days the interpreters will be there, what days they're going to do audio-visual description, and like 2 weeks before the show opens or the event opens and the program opens. So I would say that would be my micro thing. I would say my major thing is really going to be to examine like the structure of your organization and see what you need to do to make sure that there are disabled leaders within the organization and make sure they are empowered to be able to provide the feedback that is sorely needed to make sure that your organizations are accessible to all those that may come to see, whether as an artist, a patron, a volunteer, or an employee.
Excellent, thank you, panel. We are going to move into our guest Q&A now, and we have some really good questions in there. I did also want to give a shout out. Some of us here today are members of the Disability Lead Network, and I think that is a good place. I know, Richard, I keep hearing you talk about, I'm not sure if I said that, but this is Zhen. I'm sorry if I didn't. I hear you talk about like leaders, and I know you guys are all consultants as well, but just a place to check out to look for people to kind of continue conversations around this. But to move into our Q&A from the audience, the first question that I have for us today is, are there resources out there to share job postings with folks with disabilities specifically? So the person wants to share that they're a safe place to apply and is wondering if there are specific sites or other places, ways to go about sharing their job postings with people with disabilities.
This is Whitney. I know that from my experience working within different nonprofits within the Chicago area, I know that a really easy way is to contact different nonprofits in your area. Let them know that there are job openings. Send along to the director or whoever is in the program management there, the job description. You know, try to interface as much as you can with, you know, with, I would just say that you will get a lot of, I think, a lot of positive feedback with that.
This is Richard. I don't know if there's any resources specifically to share job postings, but I wanted to comment on this because there is a line that I see in a lot of job postings that makes me instantly recognize that this is not necessarily a place that puts disabled people at the forefront. And that is, the job posting says, must be required to lift 15 pounds. As soon as I see that, I'm like, this is probably not an organization that is really considering disability. And that's one of the things that I always look for, like when I was looking for a job, to see whether or not it would be a safe space for people with disabilities. So I encourage leaders, when you post the job postings, to really look at the postings you are posting and look for language at that may somehow exclude people with disabilities. Because we are looking for those things, we are seeing them, and we are acknowledging that it might not necessarily be a safe space for us to apply.
This is Charlie. I actually don't know of a single source place to post such jobs. My recommendation, though, is to work with an organization that is run by people with disabilities in some aspect of what you're trying to do, and then poach. And I don't think there's enough poaching going on in the community, but that's the way that you would advance if you were trying to move into another aspect of your field. You would go look for someone who's an expert in that area, get some exposure to them, and then offer them a job. I think it should work the same way with disability.
Thank you, panel. I also see in our chat that Andy dropped in the VSA, which is an international organization on arts and disabilities, often sends out job openings looking for accessibility coordinators and other roles. So I just added that to the answer in the Q&A section. Our next question from the audience is, it's one thing that I debate about with myself a lot is balancing disability pride in my work and the requirements to disclose my invisible disabilities in an environment that's not always welcoming. They have a little commentary on how they frame the question, but they're curious to hear the panel's take on this. How do you balance kind of disability pride and disclosing in a place that you're not quite sure is gonna feel great?
This is Richard. I'd like to go first because that is real. That is a very, very real feeling. I know I personally experienced that myself. There were years when I refused accommodations just because I didn't want to be thought of by my colleagues, by my bosses, of less worthy of other people. That is 100% real thing. It's 100% something I empathize. I want to encourage, everyone's going to be on their own journey in terms of how much they're willing to express about their disability. Everyone's on their own journey, and it's not really my place to gatekeep and say that you must express disability pride for the betterment of people that come after you. You don't have to. You first must always take care of yourself and put yourself first. If you feel like it's not a safe space to express your disability at this point in time, it's fine. You don't have to. You need to put yourself, your mental health first before anyone else. Because you're not going to be able to help others if you are not in the right place to do so. I will say that I hope that you will eventually be able to express the pride in your disability that I do. And I think Charlie mentioned that it's a really great place to apply for is with other disabled organizations. Currently, my day job, I do work for a great organization called Communication Service for the Deaf. And because they are a disabled-led organization that is geared towards people with disabilities, I feel safer, more comfortable, and able to express my pride in my deafness, my disabilities than I have anywhere else. I think it's a matter of really finding a place that encourages you to do that.
This is Charlie, and I mean, I think that's a profound question. And I mean, I think we have to recognize this is, that there are communities inside the disability community, and they have different tools at their disposal. Part of the reason I think there could be an initial push for physical accessibility is it's really hard to hide physical accessibility. You're not faced with a question. You're just, outed kind of by being there. And so, I mean, I don't feel at all competent to, give much advice here. But if it's not too esoteric, I would share that, we're really brainstorming all the time how to communicate with the judiciary when we're just trying to get basic regulations for disability access enforced. Like, there is this sort of like national question, like, what does it really mean to be integrated? And it's a little easier for me to do this on transportation, but there are literally cases where the judges sort of set the question like, is it just good enough if the person can finally get to the same destination? Or do they have to have a right to use the same kind of transportation and get there at about the same amount of time? And they get to profoundly different life experiences, which way you go. And, many of the people I work with, we all assume like, if the judges had a better grasp of like what the world was really like if you had a disability, the judges would say, no, you have a right to every kind of transportation that's out there. And you should be able to get there the same amount of time as everyone else, because that's how you're going to be competitive in this world, and you're going to be able to advance. But that's not we get a lot of judges who don't have that vision. So even in a workplace or in personal situations, I think it's the same thing. We have this need to move our culture forward in terms of what do we think integration means? Does it mean you just have a minimal amount of rights, or you can actually really integrate in all the aspects of our culture? And maybe if we work on the culture, the individual battles for how to live your own individual life will be less difficult if they're won first on that bigger picture level. Just like if I could convince the judges to see the world differently, my individual cases would be easier to win.
This is Whitney. I think that similar to what the other panelists are saying, this is a very thoughtful and very true question. I feel like anyone who has had to kind of grapple with functioning within a job and then trying to function around their disability could probably relate to this question. As similar to what the other panelist said, you're not always going to be within a safe space where you feel like you can openly talk about what your disability or your needs are. And I feel like for me, I think the biggest thing is trying to ensure and find an outlet where you can express yourself. For a lot of people, their job is their everything. So not being able to share that part of themselves with their job does become a bigger issue. And sometimes, it becomes especially a bigger issue where you might feel you might not be able to express what your disability is at this job or at the next job or at the next job, because you might not feel like you ever are going to have that safe space. And so, that's a very personal, kind of thing to navigate, but I just really encourage to try to find that safe space for you. There are tons of arts organizations out there where you can get creative with expressing how that is. There's a lot of leadership opportunities out there where you can find your voice. We talked about Disability Lead, they're a wonderful organization that can help you find your voice and your pride and your empowerment within your own disability, and then how to merge that with your career. And so, I would just encourage you, don't give up hope, to keep trying to find that outlet. And I feel like sooner or later, you might be able to feel comfortable with being open in your job about your disability.
Thank you all. This is Zhen. The next question is, what advice do you have about how to reach out to the disability community for advice without seeming like we want them to do the work for us?
This is Charlie, and I guess I'm going to just jump in and tell an old war story. My old boss, a woman named Marca Bristow, used to do all these talks for people who were just coming to Access Living because they didn't know anything about disability, and this was a new avenue of the world to explore, and they were going to sit down in our organization and learn about people with disabilities. An awkward sort of a thing, I think, for someone with a disability to address. But she would begin most of those meetings by looking around the table and saying, hi, how many of you here know someone who has a disability? And, almost 100% of the time, everyone at that table knew someone with a disability. I mean, disability is just too common for you to really grow into an adult and not know someone with a disability. And so, when you reach out to the disability community, I think the place to start are your own circle of acquaintances and friends, because people with disabilities should be in those circles. We just don't necessarily think about our friends and our colleagues in those terms as a first thing. Sometimes we have to step back and realize, I know a lot of people in that community. And if you really don't, you can call any of the organizations represented here on some level. We'll find people for you to engage with, but that's my first step.
This is Whitney. I would say, there's a lot of wonderful organizations out there where you can volunteer and you're able to meaningfully interact and give back to the community in a way where you're not trying to examine them, and which I think is what we're talking about is the biggest difference. Examining someone like underneath the microscope to figure out how they tick and why they're different versus being able to empathize with them, being able to better understand what their experience is like and being able to have a meaningful conversation from that. I know that one organization I used to work with, we would bring in volunteers all the time to read and record text and print for those with who are blind or had visual concerns. And for a lot of times, it was our volunteers' first time being put in that position at all with someone who had a different understanding of their vision. And it was always fascinating seeing them peel off those layers of stigma of what they thought it meant to be blind and visually impaired, and actually work with someone who is, and being able to understand how they can be a better steward for that person, how they can just pick up some simple key points to better, to just be a better advocate for the community. So I would say volunteer. There's a lot of volunteer opportunities where you can get those meaningful experiences.
This is Zhen. Thank you, everybody. I would also like to add, as an answer to this question, is hire a person with a disability as a consultant. and then have them do the work, but pay them for it. And that's good. It's good. You're good on two points: hiring folks and somebody doing the work from a disability community already, who probably also has a network or resources or access to other people who would help them get the advice that you need, or figure out how to guide the questions that you're looking for to get answers to. All right, some more questions from the audience. One of them is, how can the disability rights movement intersect with other marginalized groups, movements? So how can we support each other? I know at least one of you has mentioned kind of intersectionality. And so, are there any kind of takeaways of how, I guess, to be best intersectional, how to support other groups that are kind of moving toward similar ideas of civil rights?
This is Richard. One of the things that I think that leaders and people in the disabled community really need to acknowledge in terms of intersectionality, and especially the wonderful history of the disabled rights movement, is we would not have gotten here if it hadn't been for the work of Black Panthers, if it hadn't been the work of Black leaders throughout the community. My philosophy since has always been that I try to follow the lead of the Black community. They have been the forefront, the leaders in the equal rights movement. And I think we can learn a lot from following their lead and seeing where they take us. Because even the last 2 years, especially, there's been a lot of focus on the police brutality, for example. And we talk a lot about how Black people are disproportionately targeted by police and either killed or brutalized. The one thing we don't necessarily talk about as much is that almost 50% of people that are harmed by police have a disability. We need to consider these intersectional lenses as we look towards the way disability is viewed in America. And the best ways we could do that is by supporting people of color, BIPOC individuals, as they work to acquire their rights, because it really is, I hate these words, but it's a trickle-down effect of the rights that we acquire as disabled individuals do come from the work that Black leaders have done, that other people of color have done throughout their history, and they in turn have uplifted us and supported us. We need to acknowledge that the work that Black leaders have done, both in the disabled community and without, and give them the recognition and acknowledgement that they deserve. Because far too often they are not acknowledged when we talk about the disability rights movement in the United States.
I think this is Zhen. Seems like that summed that one up. Whitney, Charlie, if you guys want to chime in, jump on. Otherwise, I'm going to move to the next question. Good. So there's a question here that says, some people with different types of disabilities don't necessarily identify as being disabled or having a disability. The person says, thinking even of people with long haul COVID who are new to the community. Is it important for people to identify as disabled as opposed to their category of disability? For example, someone with ADHD might not identify as having a disability. So I think in that question I'm hearing, is it important to, but also why would it be important to, or what does it do to identify as being disabled versus a specific disability?
This is Charlie, and I'll jump in first if that's okay. I'm going to start by saying that there's a small program here at Access Living that works with disabled students as they create transition plans to leave high school and move into a work environment. And that program generally does not put the word disability in the basic introductory literature, because they found that parents whose students were receiving disability services and who needed transition plans at the end of their high school education because of their disabilities did not identify as having children with disabilities. But the non-identification is quite broad in many respects. So this is not, I don't think this is a small issue, but the one side of it that I think I'm somewhat competent to speak about is that the power in the legislative fashion or in the social fashion comes from uniting. That, if all we're trying to do is get one particular disability type access to a cultural institution, the number of people that we're talking about is small enough that we don't have a power base to force change in an effective way. If we join together, like the community did around passage of the ADA, now we have a power base that can actually get some things accomplished. So I'm not trying to downplay the social aspect of it. And I'm just saying that the area that I feel more competent to respond to is that there really is a power dynamic in coming together, and despite the differences in the disability community, recognizing that there's a fundamental aspect here, which is society has something built that is making it difficult to integrate, and a desire to rebuild society so that all people can integrate into that society, regardless of disability.
This is Whitney. I think there's a historical precedent within the Black community of just not having the same access, and which includes a vocabulary to literal access to doctors. And I feel that that systemic issue is still being felt today. I think that, yes, it is. I think that there's a lot of power that comes from being able to proudly identify, not only identify, but also proudly identify with, being disabled, and being able to see on a broader scale that there is a community there for you, resources, support, etc. But I also think that you can't undervalue or underplay the fact that being comfortable with an identity is a very personal thing. And so I think that, we can't gatekeep how someone processes their disability, the language that they might use for that. I feel that one of the best things that we can do is to still provide an open space for them, even if they might not be identifying as disabled as what other people might. But I think still keeping a space for them, and still keeping open ears as to why it is difficult for them to claim that disability status in the way that we see as a meaningful change to better, advocacy and power in the future.
This is Zhen. Thank you for those answers. And to be our final question right now is about how can we reduce disability hierarchy within the community? I think the person is asking, for example, many people with intellectual disabilities may not be taken as seriously as someone with a physical disability. And I think in our conversation today, we've talked a lot about the ADA as a floor, definitely not the ceiling, but it's the floor, and how people meet, those basic needs, or maybe only think of physical access to the building as accessibility, and are leaving out communication access, or leaving out making spaces feel welcoming and inclusive, providing that web kind of content ahead of time where people can autonomously make their own decisions about if the space is right for them and how they'll navigate it before they get there, and then feel confident in it. So I think the hierarchy, personally, I think the hierarchy plays into that and the way that we see the hierarchy socially. And so how can we reduce disability hierarchy in the community? And maybe specifically, if you can, kind of how can cultural practitioners help to reduce disability hierarchy?
This is Whitney Hill. I think for me, it comes down to representation. When we typically when we typically think about disabilities or the type of disabilities, I feel like we typically get the same kind of image in our head. If you're Black or brown, you're typically not really seen in that in that image, and you're typically not even brought into the dialogue. And then if you bring in something like mental health, something that once again has a web of stigmas that are just surrounding it, I feel like, you just have to have representation. You have to show that this population does exist and that this is what disability can look like. I feel that once people are able to identify with what they see visually, they're able to kind of have a better understanding of what that might actually mean for them as a person.
This is Charlie, and I'm going to stop talking soon. But, boy, call us out. You're getting into the dark side of the disability rights movement here. But the lawyers, and that's why I'm willing to talk, the lawyers are a part of the problem. It's like when we passed that damn law, the law gives most of the power that lawyers have on physical access. So physical access took a priority because we could make progress. I think one of the things that we're actually starting to move on is starting to envision what a reasonable accommodation is for a lot of non-physical access disability issues. Like the state of Illinois has now committed to rolling out mobile mental and behavioral health services, non-police provided mobile response when someone is in a mental or behavioral health crisis. I mean, I think that eventually, as that becomes an active working thing, this could be part of the game changer. We're no longer talking about someone is in crisis in a mall, we're going to call the cops and run them out for trespass or some bogus sort of criminal thing. We can actually accommodate someone who happens to unfortunately have a crisis in a public place. And when we have those new tools, we'll be able to design more rights to support that group. But while I see that hope, I also see that this is going to be a long journey to balance out the damage that was caused by giving rights mostly for physical access in the law.
This is Zhen. Thank you, panel. Thank you very much. I would like to welcome Nick back to close us out in a minute, but this has been us, and I hope that everybody has had a great time. Panel, thank you again, Whitney, Charlie, Richard. You can find them all on social media or at Access Living. In the chat, there was dropped a link to a document with more information about them. Welcome back, Nick. Take it away.
Glad to be back, and thank you all. Thank you all so much from our panelists. Hello, everybody. It's me again. We haven't talked to each other in a while, but I am back to close out our presentation and just offer a deep, thank you, special thank you for all of our guests, Ashley, Charlie, Whitney, Richard, for all the invaluable conversations and information that you were able to, give us today with all of this. So thank you so much to all of our accessibility service providers and to the CCAC production team, all you all behind the scenes that are making all of the chats and everything work. Thank you all so much for all of your help for putting this on. This was a great conversation. And then thank you all for joining, for being with us for an hour and a half. It was a long time. We all know you're busy people. Everybody's got something else to do. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to stick with us and for offering your support to the CCAC. So in the chat, you will find a link to our feedback survey. So if you could do that, we would like to invite you to complete it. And then you can also find us on social media. You can find us via the links in the chat as well. So stay tuned for our next upcoming event. It's going to be taking place in May. And thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day, and for our panelists for all the great discussion. Thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your Thursday.
Fade to Black, white text on black background. Cultural communities advancing disability rights. Presented by Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium. For workshop resources and more information, visit chicagoculturalaccess.org. Speakers: Nick Joseph, CCAC, Overview of Disability Rights by Ashley Eisenmenger, Public Relations Coordinator, Access Living of Metropolitan Chicago. Panel discussion: Moderator, Zhen Heinemann, D-Case. Charles Petrof, Senior Attorney, Access Living of Metropolitan Chicago. Richard Costas, Actor, Director, and Freelance Accessibility Consultant. Whitney Hill, Accessibility Specialist at LCM Architects and Founder Director of SPORK. Workshop Accessibility, Efficiency Reporting, Real-Time Captioning, AI Media, ASL Interpreters. Video Editing, Captioning, and Audio Description by BridgetMelton.com.